Salute, my Quickclassics friends. Hope everybody's doing well today. Welcome to another episode of Quickclassics. Again, if you like the content, I'd appreciate it if you would click a like, subscribe, and share this video. And let's get started. Today we continue with our study of Achaean civilization and give you a quick synopsis of the Mycenaeans who lived on the mainland of Greece. Now, in terms of a time frame that we're looking at here, we're still in the late Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization stretches from about 1600 BC until about 1100 BC. So again, we're still looking at the late Bronze Age. This is sometimes called the Helladic Age or the Helladic period, derived from the name that the Greeks actually used for themselves, Hellas. So, to sort of connect this with the last lecture, this is the period of the demise of Minoan civilization. So, after the explosion on the island of Thera, and Minoan civilization is certainly still there, but it's in decline. And to fill in the power vacuum, here come the Mycenaeans, so named for the central city of Mycenae, that contains a lot of the interesting features in architecture that archaeologists have been able to retrieve. Now, interestingly enough, there are a number of ethnonyms that survive in period literature that are recycled in later years, particularly by Homer. Now, if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey, the Greeks in question in the Trojan War are in fact the Mycenaeans. And that's a name that again is derived from the central city, but more often you'll see these other confederated names uh, utilized, like the Achaeans, the Danaoi, and the Argives. And if you look in period records, um, such as those that the Hittites kept, the civilization in ancient Anatolia, you'll run across the Achaeans, and they're referenced by the other two names um, in other records, such as that the Egyptians kept. Um, so these were people who obviously got around in the ancient Aegean world in the Eastern Mediterranean. Uh, Now, not only can a cultural or historical line be drawn in terms of direct lineality between the Mycenaeans and the later Greeks, but even more recent DNA studies have linked these two peoples very closely together. That's not to say that there isn't Minoan influence on Greek culture. There certainly was, even in the Mycenaean period. Contact with the Minoans certainly had cultural influence on the Mycenaeans. What we know about Mycenaean architecture and art is pretty extensive. They built these huge palatial structures that in some ways are modeled off of the Minoan model, with the huge central throne room and the big circular hearth in the middle. Um, Even some of the pillars that are utilized are of a kind of Minoan derivative. Um, the masonry of the period is often called Cyclopean because of the large scale that you're looking at. But um, archaeology has been able to build a pretty substantial culture narrative about the Mycenaeans. We know a lot about their daily life. We know a lot about the warfare that they engaged in. They were a militaristic society, and we also know a fair amount about their religion and burial practices. The shaft grave was the primary method of interment, and not only do we find that on mainland Greece, but we find it in all the other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, as far away as the Levant, where the Mycenaeans were actually in contact and in trade with these other peoples. And there's a whole period, in fact, of Orientalizing that takes place in which the Mycenaeans are influenced by the culture that they see in the ancient Near East, for instance. Politically, uh, we're talking about a highly centralized organization. The kings of ancient Mycenae were known as the Wanaks. Um, they had not only political and judicial responsibilities, but they also had responsibilities of stewarding shrines and priestly duties. Um, all of these features are actually not that uncommon in the rulers of early city-states. You often find this sort of theocratic monarchy in the early phases of a given civilization. Speaking of religion, many of the gods of the Mycenaean pantheon would be recognizable to students of the classics because there are a lot of these gods that show up in the later archaic and classical pantheons of the Greeks. Poseidon, for instance, the god of the sea, seems to be at the center and the top of the hierarchy for Mycenaeans. You run into other deities such as Hephaestus, the smith god, Artemis, Hera, Dionysus, even Demeter and Persephone show up in a certain form in the religion of the Mycenaeans, and of course they would pass these ideas of gods down to their descendants. In addition to the archaeology, we actually have some written records from the Mycenaeans. The script that they use, scholars called Linear B, and I reference Linear B in the Minoan discussion. Linear B we know about largely through the efforts of Sir Arthur Evans and especially Michael Ventris, the architect and linguist. And um, at least in some part, Linear B is derived from Linear A, the Greek that the Minoans spoke and wrote. Military organization is very reminiscent of the later hoplite organization, infantry organization that you find in the later periods, archaic and classical periods. Um, the fact that standing armies had to be maintained for defense and that they were called upon in large-scale campaigns like the Trojan War is evidence that in it taken with implements that we find in the art, especially depicting military activity, shows us that the Mycenaeans were. I used to tell my students they were sort of the Klingons of the ancient Aegean world, and not above, if economic circumstances called for it, they were not above raiding settlements to fill their coffers. Now, arguably, the beginning of the end of Mycenaean civilization had to do with a conflict with Western Anatolia, and Homer immortalizes this, mythologizes this in his epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, most notably the Iliad. And this is the Trojan War. Uh, we know that this was a historical event because not only does the archaeology of Hissarlik bear out that some kind of conflict took place in the 13th century BC, but there are other records such as those that the Hittites kept that mention people and place names like Priam and Agamemnon and the region Ilios, or Wilusa as it's called in the Hittite records, and Achaean, Achaewa as it's called in the Hittite records. So we know that this conflict actually took place. Was it due to Helen of Troy or Helen of Sparta? Probably not. There may be something about a botched political marriage, but fact of the matter is that this war was fought over control for the trading and shipping that went on. In other words, there were economic benefits to be derived from whoever controlled the Aegean and parts of the eastern Mediterranean. But even though this seems to have been a Mycenaean victory, the Trojan War seems to have been the beginning of the end for Mycenaeans, and you begin to see a collapse in its wake. Now, it's probably no one factor that led to this. In fact, it may be a combination of the ones that I'm about to relate to you. It's still a debated issue amongst scholars. There could have been internal conflict and squabbling over the wares taken from Troy in the wake of the Trojan War, which led to a civil war. There's some evidence to suggest that happened. One theory is that a tribe called the Dorians invaded Mycenae and some of the other cities and destroyed them. And yet another is that the sea peoples that I referenced in the last discussion about the Minoans invaded the coast and pillaged much of the coastal region of the Mycenaean Empire. That's certainly a possibility because the timeline is congruent with the account that the Egyptians give of the 12th century invasion of the Egyptian coast by the sea peoples. The period that follows is often called the Greek Dark Age, from about 1100 to 800 BC, and I'll have a whole discussion on that. It's an important period, but we don't have a whole lot of records from that era, which is why scholars have dubbed it a Dark Age. But it's an important transition nonetheless. And culture, in some ways, is still very much Mycenaean in mainland Greece during particularly the first half of the Greek Dark Age. But we'll pick up there with a discussion on the Greek Dark Age and its importance. It's an oft overlooked period in Greek history. All right, thank you for listening. Click a like, subscribe, share if you enjoy the content, and I will see you soon. Godspeed.